Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's Fireside Chat. Today I'm joined by Dr. Kirsten Ferguson, who's a business leader, company director and award-winning leadership expert. Kirsten is also a sought-after keynote speaker and author, sitting on a range of corporate boards across a variety of industries since 2008. Kirsten is an experienced non-executive director and board chair. She's a fellow of the Australian Institute of Company Directors, and Kirsten has been recognised as one of Australia's 100 Women of Influence in the board and management category. An adjunct professor at the QUT School of Business with a PhD in leadership, as well as a leader herself for more than 30 years, Kirsten is a sought-after commentator, author, coach and keynote speaker on leadership, trust and emotional intelligence. Kirsten is also a passionate advocate for women, diversity and inclusion, and was the creator of the widely acclaimed Celebrating Women campaign. Kirsten is the co-author of the award-winning book Womankind. So welcome, Kirsten, from the Howard Street Wharf studio, the perfect location for any event, whether it's virtual or live. So thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, it's wonderful to be here.
So Kirsten, let's sort of go back a few years and have a bit of a chat about what you wanted to be when you grew up and why.
Just a few years, I was saying a little while ago. I went through all the different ideas of what I wanted to do when I was at school. I'd thought about doing law, and I thought about joining the military. I'd considered being a journalist. And it's quite incredible to think some 30 years later, I've touched on all of those areas. I'm not a journalist myself, but I'm deputy chair of the ABC, and I absolutely love working with journalists. But I ended up going into the military, and after that, I did end up studying law. So I'm one of those people that obviously had an idea and has stuck with it through my life.
Yeah, right. And so when you joined the military, how old were you?
I was only 17. So I was at a private girls' school in Sydney, and I remember saying to them that I was planning on going to the Australian Defence Force Academy. And this is in the early 1990s, and no one from my school had previously gone to ADFA. And I remember them suggesting perhaps, there might be other things I might like to do. And I could have done a whole range of other things, but I was really excited by the idea of getting that leadership experience and getting paid to go to university. That was a big enticement, and just the idea of the adventure of it. So I was 17 and went off to ADFA in Canberra, where I then spent the next 4 years.
Yeah, right. And so sort of as part of your journey, what sort of, key moments in your life have really affected what you're currently doing today?
Well, I think if we think about, joining the military at 17, that was quite a big decision. But when I was at ADFA, I was there, and it was really quite challenging for women particularly. It was challenging for everyone, and it's a period where the military themselves have had a look at the conditions for cadets and the culture that was grown, at that time. And I was really fortunate, though, that I did really well, and I ended up duxing my Air Force graduating class, and I had a very senior leadership position, and it was a very hierarchical environment at that time. And I think being appointed to be a leader of my peers, and there was about 1,000 cadets, most of them male, was a pivotal moment, because that really set me on the path of being passionate about leading myself and learning from that, making plenty of mistakes and continuing to, and learning and just trying to get better and better and adapting your style. So I think joining the military was definitely a pivotal moment, and it was one of those foundational periods of my life.
Yeah, okay. So potentially also an incredibly challenging time, given that you were so young and leading men, but also older people as well. How did you how did you adapt and cope with that?
Well, that's, one of the interesting things when you're obviously leading your peers, so that's challenging enough. And at ADFA, everyone's sort of aged between 17 and 21.
Right.
And so you need to learn to adapt and how best to engage them. But once I left ADFA, I was a flying officer, and I was posted to an F-111 squadron at Amberley. And there I was absolutely leading people who had been in the Air Force longer than I'd been alive in many cases. And that's really where you learn about being a humble leader and learning from people. And command and control is not what's most effective, but actually having empathy and understanding and listening and respecting the people that you work with. But I was a total cliche, and I have to admit, I had watched Top Gun far too many times. And I met my now husband on about the second day that I was at the squadron. He was in his flying suit, and we've now been together, 25 odd years.
Oh, congratulations.
So that
That's
was another
wonderful.
pivotal posting that ended up influencing my life.
Very much so. Everybody knows we're in COVID-19. So, what does an average day look like for you at the moment, and how are you managing during these times?
Yeah, hasn't it been a fascinating time?
Yeah.
Well, look, no one day looks the same, except every day feels like the same day. So I'm not sure if that makes sense.
Yes.
I don't know if anyone else watching feels that it's sometimes hard to remember what day it is or when, something might have happened. But I'm really conscious that COVID-19's affected people in very different ways. We hear all the stories about people baking bread and buying puppies, and that is me. And it's been, a rather nice pause in my life. But I'm really conscious that for other people, they are fighting to survive, and their lives are at risk, whether it's health or new economic challenges that they're having to deal with. And so I think my day is spent working from home and, missing my children who are both away at university, but also trying to appreciate what others are experiencing, but also this chance to sort of think about how we deal with life in the future and what it might change for all of us.
Yeah, absolutely. It kind of makes you also stop and think that, once you come through the other side, and if this was to ever happen again, how would you prepare yourself maybe a little bit differently moving forward? One of the wonderful things that you have done across your career is celebrating women. And just tell us how that actually came to be, and because it then led into Womenkind for you. Tell us how that came to be.
Well, that was probably the most unexpected twist and turn of my career, and I've had a few, yet it was also the most rewarding year of my life. So for those who don't know, Celebrating Women was actually a hashtag, and it became a very large social media campaign. And it all came about because if you're on social media, and I love using social media, I think it's really important for leaders to be there, but it's just a great way of connecting with others. You can't help but notice, though, the denigration a lot of women face simply for being online and for having an opinion. And on a particular day, I remember seeing a thread of tweets aimed towards the ABC broadcaster and journalist Patricia Karvelas. And I can't even remember what that thread of tweets said now, but it was your typical trolling and abusive language. And I remember thinking, if I was standing next to PK, if that was said, and I was there, I would have done something. I would have called the police in some occasions, but I certainly would have done something. Yet online, you feel really quite helpless, a bit like a bystander. And so I took myself off for a walk along the beach and had just decided I'd had enough. I wanted to see what I could do to make even a small ripple of difference. And I had really no idea, but I called my mum, who isn't on social media and trusts me. So if you have a harebrained scheme, it's often a good person to call. And I just asked her 4 questions off the top of my head and asked her to send me some photos. And what I wanted to do is see if I could just share a woman's story and make my newsfeed just that bit more positive, even just for a little while. And I didn't tell anyone she was my mum, but I shared her answers to some questions and her photos. And I noticed that people were just interested in her story. And, she was no one in particular. She's had an interesting life, a retired nurse, but people just were interested. And I've always believed that every woman is a role model. And this showed me, yes, that I think they are. And so never one to do things by halves. I made a very bold, crazy commitment, really, the next morning to see if I could celebrate 2 women from all walks of life and from anywhere in the world every single day of 2017. And, excuse me, I had absolutely no idea where I was going to find these women. But I did, and they came, and I ended up celebrating 757 women from 37 countries around the world.
Fantastic.
So it was absolutely extraordinary.
Yeah. Fantastic. And did you underestimate the amount of work that was actually going to entail?
Yes, I did not think this through. So I'm normally someone who's very planned and, strategic in that I'll think through things and think how best to, achieve whatever it is I want to achieve. I gave zero thought to this particular project, and I'm so glad that was the case because it led to, an enormous busy year for me. It was like a whole nother job, but it was fantastic. And I think if I'd known the amount of work, the exposure, the media coverage, that there'd be a book that came from it, that I'd still be talking about it years later, I think I would have overthought it to start with.
Yeah.
And the fact that it was so organic and authentic, there was no ulterior motive, there was no money involved, there was nothing to gain other than just simply wanting to share women's stories. And these women had no barriers to being involved. We certainly weren't looking, or we as in I, there was nothing that I was looking for. There was no criteria. You simply needed to identify as a woman, and I certainly celebrated transgender women as well.
Yeah.
And what it really taught me though, Anne, and I think that's so important, is that old saying that if you should be so successful as to achieve your own goals, you should lower the ladder down for those who come behind. We need to forget the bloody ladder.
Yep.
The ladder only ever has one person on it at a time. And if you think about it, you hold on for dear life so that no one can get past. And what Celebrating Women really taught me, and hopefully others, is that we can all throw down a fishing net and bring up many, many women together, all of us holding the sides. And through being so inclusive, the women I was able to celebrate were so diverse, and it was a wonderful year.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And I think one of the beautiful characteristics that I love about you is that you're an incredibly optimistic, positive person. Probably one of the most optimistic and positive people I've ever met. How has that sort of led you through life?
Oh, it's a choice at times. I think we all have the ability to look at a situation and choose how we'll respond. I'm not always optimistic. There's definitely times if you saw me and I'd be anxious or worrying about a particular situation. But on the whole, my default, I think, is optimism, because it's part of leading is you're influencing those around you, and the response that you have to a situation or to a crisis is really going to set the tone for how others respond as well. And so it's not about being Pollyanna-ish, as in everything's great and it's all going to be fine and let's work through it and we'll all be terrific. It's a bit more, I'm not sure if you've heard of the Stockdale paradox. Mm-hmm. And Admiral Jim Stockdale was the highest decorated US military prisoner of war in the Hanoi Hilton in the Vietnam War. And he spoke about how you needed to retain the faith that you'll succeed. This is to his men who were also being held as prisoner of war. And you can't lose that sureness of success, and that's my optimism. But you have to balance that with a real awareness of the brutal facts of your situation as well. And this crisis has been a perfect example of leaders really needing to balance those two competing demands. You've got to have optimism that we are going to get through this. We know that.
Yeah.
We're going to succeed. We might look different at the other end, but we will get through it. But we've also had to really balance, especially as leaders, the brutal facts of the impact on our businesses, the fact we've had to stand down staff, that our whole industry might have changed beneath us and that it's never going to look the same again. Both those things are equally true. And so I think as leaders, the optimism is really important, but you just can't have optimism on its own.
Yeah. So sort of leads into our next question in terms of, your observations on leadership sort of through COVID-19. Is there anybody who you think has performed really well and why?
There's a couple of examples that I wanted to mention. The first, I think, won't be unfamiliar to people. Jacinda Ardern is often held out, as an incredible leader. But the reason I wanted to mention her is she's very good at adapting her style. So if you look at Jacinda Ardern, you'll see her at the podium, very decisive, very strong, making decisions around lockdowns and some of the strictest in the world very early on. But you'll also see her doing a Facebook Live where she does a Q&A with the population of New Zealand in her tracksuit pants and jumper with baby vomit on her shoulder saying, I've just put my daughter to bed, how can I now answer your questions? And that authenticity and that willingness to adapt to your environment is incredibly important for leaders. And she does that exceedingly well. And I think for every leader, it's really important to remember that the style you have in one environment isn't going to be the most effective in another, and you actually do need to really be able to mix that up, and people are looking for it. The second leader I wanted to mention is Arne Sorensen, and he's the CEO of Marriott International.
Yep.
He did a speech that some people might have seen. You can see it on his LinkedIn page. It only goes for about 5 minutes at the very start of the crisis to his 100,000 or so employees around the world. And he just epitomised empathy, which is so important. He lived and breathed this Stockdale paradox. So in this 5-minute speech, he's vulnerable, he's candid, incredibly transparent, and I've called for extreme transparency in situations like this. He gets emotional and he's very real. Yet he's also very decisive and almost strident in his belief that they'll succeed. And so he's an exceptional example in just a few minutes of a leader who's able to sort of live and breathe a lot of these qualities that I've been talking about. And then the third one, I think, is this idea. I speak a lot about emotional intelligence and how having the intellect is not enough. You've got to be able to have the emotional intelligence to bring people along with you. But that doesn't just mean sitting around and kumbaya-ing and, hugging it out. It's about actually being able to use all those skills and being really decisive and making rapid decisions at times without all the information. And if I think about Adam Silver, and he's one of the commissioners of the NBA in the US, I don't know if you remember, but right at the start of the crisis, I think before even Australia went into a lockdown, certainly the US wasn't thinking about it, the NBA season was cancelled. And so he made a decision very early on in the face of not much information. He couldn't have predicted precisely what was going to happen in the US. He would have had sponsors and board members and others saying to him, are you crazy? Can you imagine the financial implications? What are you doing? Why are we going first? Yet this particular man, I don't know him, made a very significant decision in the face of considerable uncertainty. And I think as leaders, we need to be able to do that and to recognise that we are by nature risk averse. We want all the information and the data, and are we making the best decision, and let's just wait and see. Yet this crisis has reminded us we can't always do that. And I think the better leaders are the ones who acted quickly and were prepared to accept that they might not get it right, but they're making the best decisions then and there.
So sort of, leading on from that, we're sort of still dealing at the moment with uncertainty and quite a bit of ambiguity, and there's so many people still working from home. What would be your advice to leaders who are actually managing people remotely? Because it's a very different interaction when you're actually on a Zoom call or something like that. So what would your advice be?
Well, I think it comes down to a lot of empathy. So empathy is really being able to put yourself in the shoes of others and to understand what their needs are, what they're experiencing, and almost without them telling you, you being able to put your own ego to the side and really understand what someone else needs. I think this crisis has really made that critical. So you need to know if the person who's in your team is also homeschooling or educating from home, 4 kids under 10, and you're there expecting them to have delivered whatever they might normally deliver in their workplace with no distractions. I think unless you're able to really empathise and make some moderation to your expectations, there's going to be issues. I don't know if you recall, but at the very beginning, I think leaders were checking in all the time. So, hey, what do you need? And driving people probably to distraction as well. That's where trust comes in. So I encourage leaders before your staff are going to trust you, you really need to trust them first, and you'll then earn their trust. But this crisis, again, for those leaders who are not used to leading a remote workforce, you don't have people out the front of your office that you're sort of keeping an eye on. Not that that's a way of leading that I encourage, but for those leaders who that's comfortable, they're having to totally reassess, well, how do I know that Sally's doing everything that I've asked, or that John's actually working the number of hours he's supposed to? I think we've all learnt through this crisis, none of that's actually relevant. It's what's being delivered. It's perhaps resetting what the performance markers are. And these will change as we return to work, or I think you'll be finding a lot of people want to stay home, or they want this hybrid version of working from home and coming into the office if and when they want to. So the way of leading will never be the way that it was before COVID. But I think there's so many opportunities for people to really reset their new normal for how they lead as well. And the optimist in me says that that's a very good thing.
Yeah, no, I would agree. And I think, everybody, so many people, I don't think across all industries will have had key learnings from this. And I think you're absolutely right. Sometimes as a leader, you absolutely get it right. And sometimes as a leader, you don't. And that's just sort of the reality of what we're currently in from a COVID-19 perspective. You touched a little bit on there just around trust. There's been a number of recent failures recently from a corporation perspective, and a number of royal commissions and everything going on. Trust is so important these days, and probably going to be far more important as we come out of COVID-19, and communities are really starting to look to organisations and corporations that have potentially supported them and have been open and transparent with them through COVID-19. How do you actually look for the signs and even potentially intervene if you're in that situation where you can see that there is potentially going to be a lack of trust coming out the other side from a corporation perspective?
Well, I think if you've identified there is a lack of trust, you need to be acting straight away. And you can't expect one day to just wake up and say, I'm going to throw money at this and they're going to trust me next week. That's not how it works. It's an intangible. You can't buy it. You can't trade your way out of distrust. It's a slow process where the person that you're hoping will give you their trust is a very precious commodity. And so I think for any corporation or any leader or anyone who's dealing with a crisis of trust, transparency is number one. Being prepared to be extremely transparent, including saying, we got it wrong. This is why I made the decision. I thought at the time it was the right one. But for this reason and this reason and this reason, we clearly got it wrong. We didn't listen. We didn't hear you. We didn't act quickly enough. And here, though, is what I'm going to do to fix it. And you actually set out what it is you're changing, and then you make sure you do it. Now, you're still not going to have trust at the end of that conversation. It could take months or years to earn the trust of others, and that will only happen by every time you make a decision, or you choose to act in an ethical way, or whatever it might be that you've lost trust over. Slowly you'll be getting credit back in the bank, or in you, or whatever it might be, to be able to make decisions that people are prepared to trust again. But I think as an individual leader, what's so important is, as I said before, leading with empathy, being prepared to admit mistakes, putting ego to one side. There's a concept of servant leadership. We are there to serve those we lead. They're not there to serve us. And I think as leaders, that if you truly, authentically believe that, it's a lot easier to earn trust. It can be lost in a microsecond, but you need to continue to live and lead in a really purpose-driven and ethical way, and that's going to assist.
Yeah, okay. I'll ask you another question and then I'll jump onto questions, Kirsten. So you've talked a lot today about emotional intelligence. So how important is it? Clearly very, but why is it so important?
Well, I think it really doesn't matter how many degrees you've got, how much experience you've got in an industry, how many Nobel Prizes you might have, if whatever it is you're doing, you're not able to bring others along with you. If you can't lead in a way that's got empathy, that you're self-aware of the impact that you're having on others, you'll just never be effective as a leader in really driving change, of uniting people behind a purpose or a vision. Daniel Goleman, who was the father of emotional intelligence, spoke about how he had the Forbes sort of 500 or, Fortune 500 company CEOs in a room, and he asked them to put up their hand how many of them had been valedictorians at their universities, so duxing it, and there was less than 10, because the people in that room who had succeeded as being leaders were not the smartest people in the room. They were the ones who could build relationships and be trusted, and I think that's why being a well-rounded leader, you obviously have to have the intellect to be in the role and to know how to make decisions and how to best serve your stakeholders and the industry that you work in. But having the emotional intelligence to actually deliver all of that is key to succeeding.
Okay. I've got a couple of questions I'm going to throw to you now, Kirsten. A question from Gail. It would be good to hear your approach when taking on a new team to build a strong team culture.
Great question. And I've had a few people asking me this. I've been doing a leadership Q&A series on LinkedIn. If anyone's watching is on LinkedIn, and I've been asking people who have answering questions from around the world. This particular question has probably been the most common. So I think it's a terrific one to think about. If you're a new leader in a new role or a new organisation, listening, finding out what the experiences have been of that team, understanding from them a bit of the history. Has there been a lot of change that team has just gone through? Have they got change fatigue and you're going to come in there all bright and bubbly and ready to go? And we've all been on the other side of that. And you're thinking, oh my God, I'm exhausted from the last person. So finding out a lot about the history, really understanding each of the people that you'll be working with on a personal level, what drives them, what motivates them, what they think needs to happen. And I think a bit less doing and a lot more listening in that first period is really important. Although I remembered the other day that in my first role, I sort of promoted into, when I left the military actually, and went to join a law firm and I was put into a management role, I went out and bought this book called The First 90 Days, and I picked it up the other day, and there's all my markings in it from 20 years ago where I've ticked off what I'm going to do and highlighted all the doing that I was going to do. I look now and think, well, perhaps a little less doing and a bit more listening, is really the right combination as well.
Yeah, okay. Fantastic. A question from Michelle. I'd love to hear your view on the future of work, flexibility and remote teams as it relates to culture and leadership.
Another great question. Yeah. How do you build a culture when you can't see each other? I do think it's possible, and I think we're just going to find ways to adapt. I mean, some of the really, it's almost tokenistic, but still important, is having end-of-week drinks still, or people wearing their hats, and we've all seen different ways that teams are staying connected. I saw there's virtual cooking classes people were doing. I've got an event next week where they are delivering the meal. So I'm not quite sure how that's going to work, but I liked the sound of that particular one. So, I mean, that's a very simple way, but I think as a team, you really need to get together, perhaps virtually, and work out what kind of culture do we want in this new way of working. So what is the aspiration for how you're going to work together as a team or as an organisation? And what expectations do we have about, if ever, meeting face to face? And so if we're going to do that, rarely, how can we make the most from that? How can we get everyone together, perhaps once a quarter or whatever it's going to be, but really have that as a time where it's not just a meeting where we're ticking off agendas, but we're really doing some development work together, or whatever it might be. So I think leaders really need to think through what their culture is going to look like, but it'd be a mistake to think that there won't be a culture just because you're not physically in the same place. Culture exists anyway, it's there. You just want to be able to at least play a part in defining what that is, because the culture will develop around you. So for leaders, I'd be suggesting you get on the front foot and really work with your team about what you want that to look like.
Awesome. And a question from Paul. Would love to hear Kirsten's thoughts on being a middle manager. What advice would you give to middle managers to lead an effective team whilst trying to influence decisions above?
Oh, I feel for all the middle managers in the world, because you get squeezed, Paul. I'm feeling for you, because you've got people who are in your teams that you're leading, and often you've come or been promoted from those teams, so you're promoted from within, and that's tough in itself. And then you're trying to work with demanding leaders that you're reporting to who probably, change their mind about what they want or have unrealistic expectations. I think middle managers are the most important influencers in a business. I've done a lot of work before around safety leadership and driving the culture from, the board and senior execs through the organisation. If you don't have the support of middle managers, nothing is achieved. They're absolutely critical. So, Paul, I would say to you that everything I'm talking about around emotional intelligence and leading with empathy, it applies to every leader. And I actually believe everyone is a leader. We're leaders in our families or communities or in whatever role you might be in an organisation. And really use this time, because no doubt you'll continue to move through the chain, use this time to learn to lead well. So how to influence your supervisors and your team members. Learn how to, it's a terrible term, but manage up. I don't like that idea, but it's a critical part of being a middle manager, this idea of how you can influence those leaders that you're reporting to. So really, again, and it can be hard at times, but showing empathy. So put yourself in the shoes of your boss and go, why are they flipping out over whatever it might be, or why are they so stressed on this particular KPI? Really trying to understand that, or exploring it with them, and finding out how you can support them as well is really important. So I think you guys, it's hard because you've got to satisfy the people that are in your teams that are looking to you for leadership, but also those who are leading you. And I wish you all the very best with it.
We won't get to all the questions today, Kirsten. So if people have some questions on leadership that they want to ask you, is the best place for them just to reach out through LinkedIn?
Or my website, because you can submit these questions that I'm taking from around the world, which is so much fun, I've got to say. I'm doing videos on those. So if they go to kirstenferguson.com, you'll find a section there. You can watch all the Q&A I've been doing, or there's lots of different avenues to submit and contact me however they would like.
Awesome. And final question for today. So what's one thing that you will never take for granted again post-COVID?
I think it's, again, and it feels privileged to say this, but that freedom of choice, the choice to be able to go somewhere that I want to go, or to, have family come and visit, or to visit my daughters, those choices we haven't had for some time. And I'm not sure that I'll ever take that for granted again, but it's also made me much, much more aware of the fact that so many people don't have those choices all the time, and the need for all of us, to be very aware of that and to be doing what we can to help them as well.
Awesome. Dr. Kirsten Ferguson, thank you so much for being so generous with your insights and thoughts today for our community. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Anne.